Hi, I'm James Michael Riley, and welcome to Worse, Stories of Strength and Endurance from the Old Days. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. So tonight as we talk by the fire, I hope you'll get something to eat and drink. I'm enjoying same thing I have had other times, which is polenta with squash and tomato and turkey bacon, baked by my wife Nancy in a tomato sauce, absolutely delicious. And Coke with real sugar, which is an occasional treat, something I really like. Okay. We live in a time where some say we have too many regulations. Some say we need more. I think in those debates, I probably fall somewhere in the middle. But one thing is for sure, travel is a lot safer than it used to be. So back in the late 80s, I was working briefly in Los Angeles, and I made a right turn on a red light, which was allowed in the east at that time, but was not allowed at least at that corner in Los Angeles. So I got a ticket. And my choices were either pay the ticket or go to a traffic safety class for a few hours. I was working as a Christian volunteer at the time, and my funds were next to nothing. So I decided to take the class. Turned out to be pretty interesting, not very demanding. The guy who taught it told us about a couple of horrible accidents that happened, and one of them was a train accident. There was a curve in Los Angeles where trains, of course, coming along this line had to slow down. But the driver of this train died and somehow managed to die standing up. Now, that'll be significant in a way I'll tell you about in a moment. So the train hit this curve, began to rock one way, rocked the other, threw all the passengers to one side of the train, and then flipped over. So with all that momentum, all those passengers fell down through the now breaking windows and fell under the train as it was sliding along the ground. Pretty graphic image, and some of what I'm going to talk about this is a little graphic, but I'll try to go light on you. Another memory from childhood dovetails into this, which is that occasionally for dinner, we would have something called stewed tomatoes. I don't know how popular it is right now, but they're peeled tomatoes in their own juice that have been cooked, and then you have them as a side dish. You can put them on spaghetti. They're not quite like sauce, but my grandfather, who was born in 1898, told me that the slang term for stewed tomatoes was train wreck. Get the visual? Okay, let's go. I was staying at a friend's house, and they had a very chilling book on the shelf called Train Wrecks by Robert C. Reed. And the names of the chapters were all the horrible ways that trains can wreck: derailments, collisions, bridge disasters, and others. Yikes. So, and I found out doing a quick internet search, this is just one of many books on the subject. There's a book called Red for Danger, The Classic History of British Railway Disasters by L.T.C. Rolt. Classic history of disasters? Really? Classic? There's even specialties like Ohio train disasters by Jane Ann Terzillo. And I want to treat you to one of the stories that Ms. Terzillo drills down on. The Ashtabula train disaster of 1876. So this was a locomotive and 3 passenger cars that was halfway across a bridge, and the bridge collapsed. The train fell 60 feet into a ravine. And then the lamps and stoves, now remember this was before electricity, the lamps and stoves used to light and heat the train cars quickly caught the wreckage on fire. 83 people died, 60 were injured. This was in the winter. So this same accident resulted in burns and frostbite, and of course many, many broken bones. I've looked at pictures of trains of the time. The stoves that were used to heat the train cars were pot-bellied stoves, just like you'd have in an old farmhouse somewhere, just like you might have if you're trying to save some money by getting a wood-burning stove. There it is sitting in a wooden rail car on a train that would be moving up to 60 miles an hour. Oh, good Lord in heaven. Now, this was considered the worst accident in U.S. rail history, but that was 1876. But it turns out that people of the day had the same rubbernecking impulse that we have now. OhioHistory.org has a picture of a pamphlet about that accident. And it was an old-time etching, and apparently it was a series of etchings that you could buy in pamphlet form. And the one that they featured was a picture called "The Doomed Train as it left Ashtabula a few minutes before the wreck." A pamphlet. I guess in these days it would be a website, but back then you would do a pamphlet. The problems of that sort with bridges were nothing new. Stephen Ambrose wrote a great book called "Nothing Like It in the World" about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So imagine you're in the open prairie in the 1860s. Once you had the right-of-way purchased from the United States government, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. And they did. Regulations were near zero. To give you an idea of how fast they were trying to throw this thing up, the Union Pacific, which is building the eastern half of the railroad that was going all the way to Sacramento, built trestles over ravines if it wasn't too deep. So it wasn't like a bridge that leapt the span. It was, horizontal pieces, vertical pieces, diagonal pieces, all structured together from the bottom up, holding up the train, holding up the tracks. 3 of the Union Pacific's trestles collapsed under their own weight before trains could even be driven across them, which I guess is the good news. But bridge and trestle collapses were not unknown. Actually, closer to home for me, here in New Jersey, was a very different kind of bridge tragedy. So people, you might not know this if you don't live in this area, but people who live in New Jersey or Connecticut or on Long Island, which is to the east of New York City, if those people spend time commuting into New York City, they're called bridge and tunnel people. The term's used a little bit disparagingly. You don't really live in New York, you're just a bridge and tunnel person. And it was a commuter train and a bridge that were the players in the tragedy on September 15th, 1958. So the Newark Bay Bridge was a lift bridge. So it was a railroad bridge, but it wasn't one that opened like this, like a drawbridge. It was one that went up, where the center section went up like an elevator so that ships could go under it. This was about 5 miles from Manhattan, and it was over a tidal channel. So as the tide came in and the tide went out, there would be water running very swiftly in it. And this train running inbound to New York City in the late morning on September 15th happened to be a time when the tide was running swiftly. A barge approached the channel, and the bridge operator set the appropriate signals up and down the tracks and raised the bridge. There were 3 signals. There was like a warning. There was, hey, the bridge is closed, you're getting too close. Of course, these were lights and whatever else. And the last one was just a red stop. And if you went through the red stop, there was a derailleur. That's how seriously the safety, or at least that's the way they executed serious safety protocols back then, so that you would not drive the train off the open bridge. It was designed to derail the train. On this morning, for some reason, although the engineer driving the train had slowed down to an appropriate speed, had the bridge been available to him, had been closed, he didn't stop. He didn't obey the signals, and the derailleur didn't work. The locomotive and 2 cars went off the bridge into the fast current of this tidal channel. The Daily News, it's a newspaper in New York City, reported at the time that upon recovery, and what they did was they sent a diver down to put huge straps under the train car so that it could be raised by an enormous crane on a barge. Upon recovery, one of the cars had all of its windows smashed out, as if the passengers had been trying desperately to escape this. And it's believed that some of them, I don't think all the bodies were recovered, that some of them were swept away by the current. 45 passengers, 33 railroad workers were killed. So that bridge was demolished in the 1980s. No longer needed, and perhaps just as well. But as I said, the Ashtabula one was considered the worst accident in American history until July 9th, 1918. Some of the last months of the First World War, and some of the only year or so that the U.S. was in the war. I've heard that was kind of an almost time in technology. There were things that were just coming to fruition where they could be used, but they weren't quite there yet. For example, there was wireless telegraphy on ships, but things were still not at the point where there could be voice communication on ships. That's just one example. And in terms of controllers in train stations and in train towers speaking to the trains, we were not there yet in 1918. and this played a tragic role in what happened outside of Nashville in July. So a train left the city filled with passengers. There was a train approaching the city as well. There was one track, but there was a siding where the rule was that the outbound train would pull off onto the siding, allow the inbound train to go through, and then they would go back onto the one track and continue on their way. So normally the outbound train would have received this order to do this, but something got lost in the shuffle because the inbound train was 35 minutes late. So it probably happened that somebody was under the impression that that inbound train had already passed. When the tower operator realized their error, that they had already given the outbound train the green light to proceed, the only way to communicate with them was by sounding a whistle. And that outbound train was already too far away to hear the whistle. So, unfortunately, a short ways outside of town was what they called Dutchman's Curve, where the view of the track ahead was obscured by the curve. Both trains were near their top speed of 60 miles per hour. The inbound train engineer saw first what was going to happen and hit the brakes, but it was too late. The news reports of the time said the sound was heard for miles, and the ground quaked and the waters of nearby Richland Creek trembled. 101 people were killed. They were mostly soldiers and African-American migrant workers employed in a munitions factory near Nashville that was supplying our troops in World War I. So one part of this Nashville disaster was the subject of a chapter in that book I was telling you about that I found on a friend's shelf, Train Wrecks. One car was telescoped by the other train. Telescopes is a category of train disaster. I don't know if it happens anymore, but it certainly happened back in the days when passenger cars were wooden, and of course locomotives were not. That is where trains collide, and one of them smashes inside of the other car in the manner similar to a telescope being collapsed before you put it away in your pocket. And then sometimes this would, if there was sufficient speed, then after the oncoming train telescoped the one car, that would push it into the other one and telescope that one too. So you can imagine what would happen to the passengers in these cars. So later, a device was created, a safety device called an anti-climber, which meant that the frame of the car, that is the steel part down at the bottom, the strong part, would not ride up on the other car in a collision. Now that's still a pretty horrible thing if it's two trains coming head on that they would smash like that and stop. But really what you're looking for under those circumstances is the least worse outcome of a rear end or a head-on collision. So speaking of safety devices, getting back to that LA accident I was told about in traffic class so many years ago, the fact that that engineer died standing up is significant. I don't know how it happened, if he was slumped over his controls or his arm got caught in something or what. But trains have devices that make it so you have to maintain pressure on something, or there's something that you have to physically do every short period of time to basically indicate to the electrical components of the train that you're still alive. And if you don't do it, the train begins to brake automatically. So this train had, what they call a dead man switch. It was a foot pedal that you'd have to keep your weight on. So had this guy died in such a way that his foot came off the pedal, the train would have come to a stop before it hit that curve at too high a speed. But that's not what happened here. Actually, I looked at one website, which is really startling, where the person talking about it, I guess, worked in the train industry, in the railroad industry, and said, "Oh yeah, there's that dead man pedal that you can put your lunch pail on." Okay, well, yeah, if you want to disable the safety device, absolutely, you sure can do that. Yes. So I want to thank for this story OhioHistory.org, Stephen E. Ambrose's Nothing Like It in the World, UnrememberedHistory.com, the New York Daily News, and NJ.com. Okay, friend of mine put an idea to me that I'm going to talk about with you now. Now, back in the 80s, Ronald Reagan said, "While I take inspiration from the past, like most Americans, I live for the future." And so now he said this in the past, I'm guessing. And there's another example of something like this. You'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. After the Munich Agreement was reached in Europe in 1938, where Nazi Germany was given permission by the other countries of Europe to take part of the country of Czechoslovakia as long as they promised they wouldn't take any more. The British Parliament convened to vote on whether the British government would support this or not. The overwhelming number of people did. They thought, this is when Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister at that time, got off the plane famously saying, "It is peace in our time." Winston Churchill saw it as a disaster. So in the debate, when Churchill rose to speak, he said he wanted to make people understand that in a period of time that may be measured in years but may be measured only in months, the rest of Czechoslovakia will be engulfed by the Nazi regime, and that it was absolutely vital that the British ally with the other democracies and that they strengthen their defenses. And he said, "Not all wisdom is new wisdom." He quoted an Anglo-Saxon chronicler from 1,000 years before, who was talking about the reign of a king I've never heard of, King Ethelred the Unready. The chronicler said, "All of these calamities fell upon us because of evil counsel, because tribute was not offered to them at the right time, nor yet were they resisted. But when they had done the most evil, then was peace made with them." Churchill read this in Parliament as a means of saying to people, we don't have to have this happen. This is the past as a warning, which is a form of looking at things that they were worse in the old days. Let's take comfort from knowing we can make a different choice. So this idea was suggested by our viewer and my friend Marty from Indiana, who said, have there been times in the past when people have looked to the past and said things were worse back then? And the answer, as we are discovering, is yes. And I think the Bible is a really good example of a series of stories that people turn to take comfort and inspiration from, looking at how people have gotten through difficult things in the past. And one example is the story of the Babylonian captivity of large percentages of the Jewish people. This is also known as the Babylonian Exile. It started in about 598 BC and happened in several stages, and then finally ended about 60 years later in 538 BC, when the Jewish people were finally allowed to return to their home in Judea. And if you read the Bible, you discover ways that people got through that awful time. Religious faith, God's intervention, good luck, patience, staying together, keeping your traditions alive. And people who were brought to America as slaves, Africans brought here as slaves, can say that the past wasn't worse than what they were experiencing. They were experiencing the same thing, but still they found a way to take comfort in it, to see their story as a reiteration of a biblical narrative in which God does intervene. But for most of us, I would say, a past where your whole people is taken into slavery by another country, yeah, that's worse. And I wonder at that time, if they look back at the time when the Jews were building the pyramids in Egypt, as saying, oh wow, the old days were even worse than we have it now. I don't know. But I think sometimes looking to the past to find stories of strength and endurance, it's like a bucket brigade of knowledge and hope. I read a biography of Lincoln, or I should say I listened to the audiobook of a biography of Lincoln by David Herbert Donald, simply titled Lincoln. So one of Abraham and Mary Lincoln's sons, Willie, died in 1862 while they were living in the White House. And one of the things that Lincoln would do to bring comfort to himself was he would sit with his secretaries and assistants, sometimes at night, and he would read aloud to them from Shakespeare. This brought him comfort. He would get volumes of Shakespeare out of the Library of Congress. And, one of the ones he liked to read after Willie's death was the lament of Constance, the widow of King John's elder brother, in the Shakespeare play King John, who has lost her son, as the Lincolns had. And he would read aloud, "And Father Cardinal, I have heard you say that we shall see and know our friends in heaven. If that be true, I shall see my boy again." Shakespeare probably wrote that play, King John, in the mid-1590s, but it takes place during the reign of the historical King John, who reigned from 1199 to 1216. So this, looking at Lincoln, finding comfort in this, is a past of the past of the past. People looking to times when it was just as bad or worse, seeking comfort and understanding. Cave paintings. Now, we can't know their purpose for sure, according to the scholars I've read, but these drawings of animals from ancient times, of hunts from ancient times that were painted on the sides of in the interiors of caves with primitive paints and natural substances and dyes. It could just be a human need for expression. It probably wasn't just decoration, because people generally, there's not evidence that they lived in the caves where these paintings took place. So they probably served a larger purpose. The Christian writer Norman Vincent Peale talks about them in his book Positive Imaging, and he says he thinks what it was people emboldening themselves by imagining success in the hunt. Here is a picture in the past of when we confronted the struggle of the hunt. And this was often, attacking with spears creatures greatly bigger than the humans that were attacking them, with all that danger, that we encountered this difficult situation and we triumphed over it. And to see that picture was to call to mind the triumph and increase the likelihood of the triumph in your own mind. We can do it because we've done it before. And that, after all, is a component of hope, knowing that we don't walk this road alone. I don't know if you saw a movie from 2007 called There Will Be Blood. It was directed by a director named Paul Thomas Anderson, and it starred Daniel Day-Lewis, who won an Oscar for his role in it. It's about the early days of the oil industry in California. And this was a time without rules. Rapid growth, some winners, some victims. There's a scene in the movie where the rock strata overlaying where they believe there is oil is being lifted up repeatedly on a derrick and being smashed down. It's sort of a pile driver type movement. It's called percussive drilling, I learned later. And one of these slips when they're in a pause in the work, and it crushes one of the workers. So this, I think, is merely one dramatic reenactment of something that happened a lot in the early days of the oil industry. So before they started doing this, petroleum was collected on the ground. It would sometimes just pool up in the ground in certain places. It was collected as a treatment for rheumatism and sprains. It was collected as lamp fuel. In those days, a lot of lamps that gave people their only means of illumination in their house, apart from candles or a fireplace, after dark, was whale oil. And there were a lot of ships out there killing a lot of whales and collecting the oil. But the question arose, so if this oil seeps up in certain places, is there more oil underground? So the first person to definitively and successfully do this while drilling for oil for the purpose of drilling for oil, not drilling for something else, was doing it, succeeded on August 27th, 1859. His name was Edwin Drake, and he was drilling in the town of Titusville in the northwestern corner of Pennsylvania. He hit oil by one of these percussive means that I was describing earlier, picking up a heavy weight and dropping it repeatedly. It's a steam-driven process that involves a big high derrick, what we think of as a classic oil derrick. And he hit oil at 69.5 feet of depth. So these derricks in these days were wooden rigs, which was good because they could be disassembled and they could be moved easily, but bad from a standpoint of, did you really want to be doing this work? Because they could be destroyed in blowouts and gushers. They could catch fire. Some of the earliest pictures of these things don't even look like what we think of as an oil derrick. They look like a glorified ladder on a horse-drawn wagon. And this is some of the ways that people were doing this work, which could result in an explosive release of oil and gas from underneath. I'm thinking when this percussive means was used, where the rock strata were broken by the repeated lifting and dropping of a heavy weight, did they have to pause so that people could get in the hole and dig away the broken rock so the process could continue? Edwin Drake, the fellow I mentioned before, who struck oil in 1859, he was in charge of this drilling operation merely as a happenstance. They didn't have somebody else who was an expert in it because nobody had ever done this before, drilling for oil. He had been a railroad engineer, and then I think possibly a railroad conductor. He recognized the problem of getting through what they call the overburden, where you would drill down and the top layers are probably just like dirt and sand, soil, until you get down to the rock that you actually need to get through. But the problem is, if you've drilled a hole through dirt and sand and soil, how do you keep that hole open? How do you maintain the integrity of the bore, as they put it? Well, Edwin Drake came up with a method, which was to line that hole with a metal pipe and to have the percussive drilling happen within that pipe. So still, after 5 months of trying to strike oil up there in Titusville, he couldn't get it to work. People started to call him crazy. His assistant got discouraged. But ultimately, he succeeded. Now, he didn't patent the idea of this, what they call a drive pipe or a conductor. But you see, one of the challenges of a lot of this historical work, looking back on how things were in the old days, is that the experiences of the average person having their day-to-day experiences have not necessarily been documented. Ken Burns did a phenomenal job with that, finding letters of people who actually fought in the Civil War, wives who were at home during the Civil War, etc. But for example, I wanted to look at the creation of Roman aqueducts, where I think most of the work was done by slaves, and I've heard a couple of anecdotal stories of how horrible that could be, but their experiences have been lost to history. So I was wondering, like say that scene from the movie Will There Be Blood, is it accurate? Did people sometimes get crushed by this thing as it went up and down? Where is the historical record? But you know what there is a historical record of? The experience of Edwin Drake himself. He was a conductor on the railroad. He got married. They had 3 kids, but 2 of them died in childhood. And then his wife died. So he and his remaining son moved to Pennsylvania. He remarried. He was still working for the railroad, but he had to go on a time of extended sick leave. Now, one of the things that went along with being a railroad worker is that even when you're on sick leave, you still had train privileges. In other words, you could travel anywhere you wanted on the train for free. And on one of these trips he was taking for free, he met an investor who liked what the guy had to say and put him in charge of this drilling project. He'd never done it before. William Bryce, who is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, said of Drake's work and what happened on that day that August 27th, 1859 became a date on which the world changed. We became a world that for over 100 years and still counting is a world whose energy needs are largely met by petroleum and other products that are drilled out of the ground like natural gas. So he hit oil at 69.5 feet. Soon the population of Titusville went from 250 to 10,000. And Edwin Drake, unfortunately, did not benefit. Within a few years, he was poor. His family was living in very dire circumstances in Bethlehem, PA. But in recognition of the importance he had to the state and to the country, because petroleum played such a large role in driving our industrial development, the Pennsylvania legislature gave him a pension of $1,500 a year. Unfortunately, he died the year after the pension was granted to him, but his second wife enjoyed it until 1916. So little factoid, as things continued to develop, Beaumont, Texas in 1901 was the first time that I believe a gusher was hit by a rotary bit, but that's another chapter of oil history. Another thing that might be interesting to know is that when people were drilling for oil back then, the fuel they wanted was kerosene for lamps. Gasoline was a waste product that they just burned off. So if the rest of history is a guide, the lives of the early oil drillers and the people who lived in the vicinity of the wells were far worse than they are in the U.S. today. But in the story of Edwin Drake himself, we find loss, suffering, and disappointment, and persistence that accelerated U.S. industrial development and brought prosperity to tens of millions of people. So I want to thank acs.org, imdb.com, energyhq.com, and oddly enough, bellamorte.net, which seems to be a website dedicated to monuments in cemeteries that had some information about Edwin Drake, whose monument is a very notable one in the cemetery where he's buried. So thanks for joining us tonight, folks. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. I'm Jim Riley. Good night.